Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are really plunging headfirst into some incredibly ancient and, frankly, profound source material. We've got a collection of excerpts from the Upanishads and also an article looking at the fundamentals of Sanatana Dharma. So our mission really is to navigate this wealth of text, try to pull out the most essential insights and understand what these traditions are telling us about, well, the fundamental nature of reality, the self, and maybe even the path to liberation. Get ready, because I think we're going to uncover some surprising connections and some really deeply insightful ideas that have resonated for, well, millennia.
Absolutely. And it's, I think, crucial to remember the context here. We're looking at texts believed to be thousands of years old from the Indian subcontinent. And it's not, a single doctrine from one founder or one specific book. It's much more like a synthesis, an accumulating wisdom tradition.
Okay, so let's try and unpack this. I mean, when you're faced with sources this vast, this ancient, covering everything from like cosmic philosophy to very detailed ethical guidelines, where do you even start? What are the sort of foundational ideas running through these texts?
Well, what's really fascinating is that even with all that diversity, certain core principles do seem to emerge pretty consistently. The sources describe Sanatana Dharma, which, often gets translated as eternal dharma or maybe eternal path, as being built not just on abstract ideas, but really on universal eternal moral principles and virtues. You see these lists emphasizing things like honesty, non-injury, purity, mercy, self-restraint, generosity. Some actions, conduct, they're right there at the core.
So ethics isn't just like a footnote. It's actually part of the bedrock.
Exactly. It's absolutely integral. And alongside that ethical foundation, there's this really pervasive idea of oneness, unity. The text strongly suggests that ultimate truth isn't, exclusive to any single path. It's more like all major faiths are aspects of one universal truth. And there are many valid ways to seek understanding. This unity, it extends right down to the idea of the self. The self within you, the Atman, is described as basically identical to the self within all beings. That Isha Upanishad quote we have is incredibly direct about it. Whoever sees all beings in the self and the self in all beings hates none. It's quite radical, actually. Misery and fear are said to come precisely from that perception of separation, the idea that I'm fundamentally different from you or, well, anything else.
Right, and here's where it gets, I think, really interwoven, this profound idea of connection, of unity. It seems intrinsically tied to the concept of karma, which pops up frequently. How do the sources explain that relationship?
Well, the text describe karma essentially as the principle of cause and effect, but on a cosmic scale. Actions have consequences, sure, but these consequences can stretch out far beyond the immediate results, carrying forward even into future lives, potentially. The soul is seen as navigating its own situation, shaped by its past actions, its unfulfilled desires, attachments, aspirations. And this is what drives the cycle of transmigration through different forms, human, animal, even states described as hells or heavens, which some philosophies see as temporary places just to experience particular karmic results.
Okay, so our current state, our future journey.
Yeah.
It's directly shaped by the ethical framework we live by and the desires we cultivate through our actions. Is that the idea?
Precisely, yes. The principle of karma connects action, consequence, and the continuous journey of the self. It directly links back to those foundational ethical principles we were just talking about. It kind of provides the framework for understanding this whole cycle of existence described in the texts.
Okay, let's pivot a bit. From the self and its journey to the nature of reality itself.
Yeah.
What is this ultimate truth, this Brahman, that the sources keep pointing towards?
Brahman. Well, the sources use a whole host of terms and analogies, partly because it's described as being beyond our usual conceptual grasp. It's pervasive, the ultimate source everything comes from, the final refuge.
Yeah.
But it's also described in these famously paradoxical ways, often defined by what it isn't. You have the phrase neti neti, meaning not this, not this. It's imperceptible, it doesn't decay, it's unattached. You sort of approach it by negating everything it's not, and yet you also have sources, speaking of the realization, I've realized this, the self, or Purusha, identified with Brahman, the most pervasive reality. So it's both transcendent and immanent.
And how does this ultimate kind of formless, paradoxical reality, how does it relate to the world we experience every day? The world of objects, people, events.
There's that powerful analogy they use, mistaking a rope for a serpent in dim light. The perceived world, the realm of names and forms, is often described as an appearance based on illusion, or avidya, which means ignorance. To the unenlightened mind, this world feels absolutely solidly real. But when that underlying internal substratum Brahman is known, the world appearance is seen as, while less substantial, maybe even a dilution of the mind. One source just flatly states the created world consists of consciousness itself.
So the world we perceive is kind of like a reflection in a mirror. It exists, you see it, but it's dependent on and somehow less real than the underlying reality it reflects.
That's a really good way to put it, yeah. The sources present the world appearance as existing like a city reflected in a mirror. And this isn't just about the physical world, you know. Many things we take as fundamentally real, our mind, our intellect, our sense of I, the ego. Even deities with limited attributes, what they call murtis, or the whole process of creation itself, these are described as unreal or transient when you compare them to the unconditional permanent nature of Brahman, which is sometimes called the partless non-dual essence.
That brings up an interesting point, though. If the ultimate reality is non-dual and beyond form, how do the sources incorporate the symbolism and, the worship of specific deities?
Yeah.
We see mentions of Lakshmi, Rudraksham beads, meditating on the sun. How does that fit?
Ah, yes. This is where the sources show their, I think, practical wisdom. While the ultimate truth might be formless, human beings relate to the divine in, well, many different ways. So the texts offer different perspectives, different paths. Meditating on the person in the sun, for instance, isn't just sun worship in a simple sense. The sun is seen to embody myriad principles, energy, sight, life force, even Brahman itself. And Lakshmi, she isn't just about wealth in the material sense. Her description, golden form, the lotus connection, giver of boons, it symbolizes prosperity much more holistically, including enjoyment, release, well-being. It's like looking at the same light through different colored lenses, perhaps. And you even find these fascinating little details, like that origin story for the name Indra, coming from Idandra, explained by saying, the gods are verily fond of indirect names. It shows this almost playful acknowledgement of symbolism and indirection, even when talking about the divine.
Okay, so if ultimate reality is like this, both formless yet approachable through these diverse symbols and practices, how do these sources suggest one actually, moves towards understanding it,
Yeah.
towards achieving liberation from that cycle of karma and desire we talked about?
Well, the texts are pretty clear. It's generally not just one single thing. They often emphasize that both knowledge, jnana, and practice, like yoga, are necessary for salvation. Often, neither one is seen as sufficient on its own.
Okay, let's unpack knowledge and practice a bit more. According to the sources, what does that actually look like?
Right. So for knowledge, there's often a structured approach described. First, there's listening, which means deeply engaging with the texts, understanding their import. Second, thinking or reflection, rigorously checking that understanding against reason, against other teachings, making it your own intellectually. Third, meditation focusing exclusive attention on that understood truth, really dwelling on it. And finally, concentration where the mind becomes utterly fixed, steady. They use the image of a flame in a windless place. So it's a path that's both intellectual and deeply contemplative. Then for practice, yoga is detailed quite extensively in some texts. This includes controlling the breath, pranayama sometimes linked specifically with chanting omkara, the sacred syllable. Specific physical postures are mentioned, of course, but also internal practices like mulabandha and uddiyana bandha, which are methods for directing vital energy within the body.
And this energy direction, it involves specific points or centers in the body, doesn't it? The chakras.
Yes, exactly. The texts list the 6 chakras and their locations pretty precisely. Muladhara at the anus, Svadhisthana near the genital organ, Manipuraka in the navel, Anahata in the heart, Visuddhi at the root of the neck, and Ajna between the eyebrows. Knowing these centers and learning to draw the vital energy, Purana upwards towards the sphere of happiness, the Sahasrara at the crown of the head that's described as part of the journey to realization. There's also Dharana, which is a deeper stage of concentration. It's explained with these fascinating elemental associations, linking different regions of the body to earth, water, fire, air, sky, each with specific mantras and deities associated with them. And another form of dharana involves consciously placing the divine essence within your own self. So, yeah, it's incredibly detailed instruction in some places.
And the ultimate goal of all this effort, realizing the self, achieving liberation, Mukshazalada, what is that state actually described as? What does it feel like, according to these texts?
It's described fundamentally as realizing the self as Brahman, becoming one with that ultimate reality. And this involves not only working through the effects of past karma, but crucially destroying the very roots of future suffering, which means dealing with mental impressions, habits, tendencies, and most importantly, egoism. The sources are quite stark here. They call the conception, I am the body, a great sin, the very root of misery and our entanglement in worldly existence. So when those latent impressions and that fundamental body identification die out, the mind becomes profoundly still, calm, and that leads to liberation, to bliss. Someone who achieves this state while still living there, called a jivan mukta, is described in really powerful terms. They possess constant wisdom, they have no ego-driven conceit about their body or possessions, they see no real distinction between themselves and Brahman, and they maintain this perfect equanimity whether they're honored or persecuted by others. It's a state of profound inner freedom, regardless of external circumstances.
Now, for those seeking the most, perhaps intensive path towards that state, the sources also describe formal renunciation, right? Sannyasa.
Yes, absolutely. The path of the ascetic, the sannyasin, is detailed. Different types are even mentioned, like Huticaka or Paramahamsa, depending on their level of renunciation. Their practices are often described as quite stark, wearing simple garments or maybe none at all, living solely on alms collected by hand. Avoiding certain foods described in rather vivid terms like clarified butter being like dog's urine or milk like urinal to cultivate detachment from sensory pleasures. It's about living a radically simple, unattached life, constantly aware of the body's impermanent, perishable nature. And what's striking is the permission given. Renunciation can be embraced the very moment true distaste for worldly life arises. It doesn't necessarily depend on age or fulfilling previous life stages. Oh, and interestingly, the sources also mention other, perhaps more extreme, paths to liberation, particularly for those like warriors, kshatriyas, who might not traditionally enter sannyasa. Things like facing death bravely in battle, fasting to death, or even entering fire or water are presented as alternative forms of intense detachment and self-sacrifice leading to liberation.
Wow. So we have these very intensive paths, including complete renunciation. But earlier, you really emphasized the importance of ethical living and duties within the world. How do the sources hold these, well, seemingly opposite ideas together? Are ethics and duties somehow less important if the ultimate goal is liberation from the world?
No, not at all, actually. The ethical principles and duties are consistently presented as absolutely foundational, especially for those living within society, the householders. While intensive renunciation is certainly one path, ethical conduct in daily life is presented as another crucial aspect of spiritual practice for most people. The sources lay out very clear duties, not just towards gods and ancestors, which you might expect, but significantly towards family members and guests. There's that incredibly powerful instruction. Let your mother be a goddess unto you. Let your father be a god unto you. Let your teacher be a god unto you. Let your guest be a god unto you.
That's not just respect, is it? That's elevating everyday relationships to something sacred, reverence.
It really is. It sets an incredibly high standard for how you interact with those closest to you, and also with those who come to you seeking shelter or guidance, like a guest. The sources also emphasize performing blameless works and consciously following the example of wise elders in the community. Even small offerings should be made with honor, with generosity, with modesty, awe, and genuine sympathy. And for practical guidance, if you have doubts about duties or customs, you're advised to seek out wise, impartial individuals who are knowledgeable in the traditions. It's very practical in that sense, too. And this emphasis on conduct, it also includes virtues like forgiveness. The sources explicitly call forgiving attacks and injuries from anyone the best course of action. Not answering harsh words with more harsh words is described as a way to sort of consume the attacker's negativity while preserving your own inner peace and capacity. So it directly links that ethical response to personal strength and wisdom.
And you mentioned the 5 great sacrifices for householders earlier. That really seems to bring spirituality right into the fabric of daily life, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. These are described as daily acts performed for universal peace and well-being, sacrifices, or maybe better, offerings or acknowledgments to the gods, to ancestors, to all beings, to other humans, and to Brahman, the ultimate reality or sacred knowledge. It shows that even activities that might seem mundane can be reframed as sacred acts of service and connection. It makes worldly life itself a potential path of spiritual practice when lived consciously and ethically. There's even that fascinating analogy mapping the components of a formal sacrifice onto the human being, the self as the sacrificer, the intellect as the wife, the ego as the priest, the senses, the elements, even virtues like compassion are seen as the materials for the offering. It suggests that, in a way, the whole of your existence can be viewed as a continuous conscious offering back to the source.
And underlying both these intense ascetic paths and the diligent fulfillment of daily duties, there seems to be this constant theme: control of the mind. How central is that in these texts?
Oh, it's absolutely crucial. Controlling the mind is presented as essential for, well, everything, for ethical behavior, for any possibility of liberation. Avoiding persistent fancy, avoiding uncontrolled desire, this is described as leading towards a mindless state. Not empty, but free from agitation, sometimes called samadhi. It's a state of freedom from compulsive mental activity. The mind, while often seen as the source of our suffering through its desires and attachments, is also called a lifeboat for those navigating the struggles of worldly life. So the texts strongly emphasize using discrimination, using conscious human effort to control and guide the mind. That's seen as vital for overcoming obstacles on whatever path you're on.
Wow. We have really covered a vast terrain today, haven't we? I mean, from the ultimate nature of reality and the self through all these diverse paths for realization to the fundamental importance of ethical living and duty right here in the world, it's clear these sources offer a really multifaceted view.
They truly do. They're exploring the deepest philosophical questions, yes, but simultaneously providing very practical guidance for living in the world. They emphasize again and again that inner realization and outward conduct are deeply intertwined. They're two sides of the same coin in many ways on the spiritual journey.
It is a lot to contemplate, definitely. But it's filled with such profound wisdom and, like you said, surprisingly practical insights.
Indeed. And I think what these sources suggest ultimately is that the path to freedom, to understanding, isn't monolithic. It's not one size fits all. It involves intellectual pursuit, yes, but also dedicated practice, cultivating ethical virtues day to day, and ultimately a really fundamental transformation in how we perceive ourselves and our connection to everything else, to the universe.
So, thinking about all this, what does it all mean for you, listening right now? Here's a final thought, maybe something to consider, drawn directly from the sources we looked at today. If the conception I am the body is spoken of as the great mundane existence and the very root of suffering, what practical steps, maybe even small ones, could you take to gently question or perhaps loosen that deep-seated identification in your own daily experience?